Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name's Elizabeth Rush. I teach in the Nonfiction writing program here at Brown, and I'm here to welcome you tonight to the final event in the 2022 Nonfiction at Brown reading series, Liza Yeager. We would not have been able to host tonight's event without the generous support of the Marshall Woods Lectureship Foundation, the Swearer Center, the Zucker Family Endowment, and the Shane Family Fund. Special thanks to Michael Stewart, who's the co-organizer for tonight's event, as well as for all of the events in the lecture series. Michael and I work really closely together on this every fall, and huge thanks to him. Additional thanks to Tira Sherlock, our amazing Utra, who made the event run so smoothly this year. Michael and I are ready to hire her every year in perpetuity. And also to Ellen, Viola, and Aaron Fine, who worked so hard to make this happen. It is my great honor to introduce to you Liza Yeager, one of my favorite storytellers. And I was very on the fence as to whether or not I was going to tell you all this, but Liza Yeager was one of my first students here at Brown, and it's particularly meaningful to me to be here tonight introducing her and welcoming her to this stage. Ours is an age of immense transformations that are ongoing at almost every single level across society. The very ground beneath our feet is changing, as is the composition of the air we breathe. Our political institutions are in turmoil, while the cost of stuff in the grocery store just keeps rising. Meanwhile, it seems that our country's citizens, the democratic body that we comprise, grows both more ample and more menaced every day. How does one go about creating nonfiction stories at such a time? What's an artist's responsibility to recording and to generating change? Over the past decade, I've had the immense pleasure of watching Liza Yeager wrestle with these seemingly unanswerable questions, producing immersive audio pieces that provide listeners with opportunities to both reflect upon and embody the changes that we have sometimes no choice but to embrace. Let me try to give you an example of what I mean. When Liza told me a couple years ago that she had made a piece about Rachel Carson, my first instinct was to groan a little bit. As an environmental writer, I thought that I knew everything about this famed author: Silent Spring, DDT, the start of the modern environmental movement. It's sort of one of those myths that just gets told and retold until it loses a little bit of its shine. But as I listened to Liza's piece, I started to understand how little I knew really about what sparked Carson's passion in the first place. Rachel Carson's often framed as an environmental crusader, a woman who loved birds above all else, but Liza's piece begins long before Carson's celebrity takes hold in a tiny coastal cottage erected on a cliff on an island in Maine, where she would first meet a woman who became really important to her, named Dorothy Freeman. Liza follows in this piece the relationship that would unfold between Dorothy and Rachel over decades, unearthing old letters, tracking down the sounds of the birds they used to listen to together. In particular, the veery, a bird whose call consists of two notes, ringing out simultaneously. Rachel and Dorothy's wonder at the call of the veery helps them to make sense of the wonder they had at their own love, says Lita Maxwell, a feminist scholar, about 10 minutes into the piece. And then Liza's voice intervenes to remind listeners that these women met in the mid-50s, when, and here I'm quoting Liza, when there weren't a lot of words for relationships that were more complicated than straight romance or platonic friendship or even queer romance. What if it is Rachel's love of Dorothy, that inspires her to keep listening to the birds around her house, to listen and listen so hard that she begins to note when the cacophony of their calls dissipates? I think that's a really radical proposition. It calls for an environmental politics of desire and pleasure rather than self-preservation. I can't tell you how many times I've returned to this story in my mind, to the idea that Liza Yeager planted there, that love, beyond language, and also the wonderment that it produces, might also serve as a starting point for profound social change. I think it's a lesson we need now, perhaps just as desperately as Rachel and Dorothy needed it then. Liza Yeager is a Brown graduate, as you guys have probably gathered at this point. So tonight's event is, among many things, a homecoming or return. Please join me in welcoming Liza Yeager to the stage.
Thank you so much. Am I talking into the mic? It's so fun to be here. And I'm especially grateful to Liz, who helped me start thinking about a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, way back when I was in school. So long ago. Not that long ago. Okay, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about listening as action. This is my subtitle, because I'm like, what does this mean? Is this something that we can aspire to? I don't know. I didn't write the title of this talk. It was kind of handed to me. And as I thought about it, though, I felt like it made a lot of sense, because a big part of why I have always been drawn to radio is because it felt like a medium that I could use to make stories that were particularly impactful. It just felt like this medium that had a lot of potential to me. I really like that in radio, the people in the stories talk in their own voices. They speak for themselves, and you can hear how a subject says something in their own words, not completely mediated through a text. I like that making radio is cheap. It's like as expensive as a recorder. And it's not that hard. I've seen people learn to make radio stories, like the tech part, in a couple hours. And on a personal level, when I think about the stories that I've encountered in the world, in my life, the ones that have stuck with me the most, or that I've really thought about often, things that have changed my mind, it is radio stories. Like, I'll often remember exactly where I was when I heard a particular story, like even if I was a little kid. So I've been working in radio since I graduated. And I've been at a bunch of different jobs and different kinds of jobs. I've worked as a freelance reporter, pitching and writing my own stories. I've worked as a producer and an editor at a bunch of different long-form narrative shows. And I've also worked as a freelance sound designer, a tape syncer. I sometimes record things for other people. And when I was thinking about this idea of listening as action, I realized that I've sort of run into it over and over. These questions about how do you use sound to tell a story that's useful. And I've run into it in a couple different ways that I'm going to talk through. Okay, so number one, I'm going to shorthand as listening as translation. When I was in school, I found myself feeling very alienated a lot of the time by the way my friends talked about their ideas. So I had all these like new super smart friends, and it was really fun because they had all these ideas that were like gonna totally change the world. But I often felt like a little bit confused by what they were talking about. I'd be like, what do you mean though? You know, and I would hear these like big theoretical concepts, and I'd be like, okay, yes, this seems good, this seems important, but like, I don't really know how I could say it back to my mom, for example. So that was hard for me. And what I realized when I learned to make radio stories was that in radio, that doesn't work. Like, you can't really talk like that because people just won't understand what you're saying. So because of the form itself, you kind of have to figure out how to say what you mean in a way that anyone can understand the first time they hear it, without a pause, without backing up and listening again. So that was like really, really exciting to me. I was like, wow, this form forces people to say their ideas in a way that anyone can understand. And so when I got out of school, a lot of the stories that I pitched starting out were based on academic ideas that I thought were really exciting and had a lot of potential to kind of like change the world, but that I thought deserved a different kind of audience than an academic paper, and should be translated into something that a larger group of people could really have thoughts and, importantly, I think, feelings about. So one of those stories is the piece that Liz was talking about in my introduction. I heard a talk in this room, actually, many years ago, it was called Queer/Love/Bird Extinction, which I was really into as a title. I thought that was really fun. And yeah, it was the story of Rachel Carson, the famous environmentalist, and Dorothy Freeman, a woman who she had this really deep and intense relationship with over 10 years. And I really loved what the scholar was talking about, and I was also like, what are you saying? Because her analysis was so dense, and I just like wasn't really sure. So I sort of gave myself this challenge as a radio producer to boil down this talk into something that I could like tell a story about and find the story in there. So I'm just going to play a clip of the beginning of the story that I ended up making. You guys should tell me if it's too quiet.
I grew up hearing a lot about Rachel Carson, and I felt like I pretty much got the point. Like, I knew the basics. Anti-pesticides, road Silent Spring, pretty doom and gloom. But recently, I heard this story that made me rethink all that. It starts with this tide pulling trip. It's 1953 on Southport Island in Maine. Carson's in her mid-40s. She's just built her summer house, and it's her first time meeting up with her new island neighbors, a couple named Dorothy and Stan Freeman. The Freemans are fans of Carson's nature writing, and they've been married for almost 3 decades that year. Stan Freeman is an amateur photographer, and you can imagine that as the 3 of them set out that day, he might have started taking photos of slippery rockweed stacked up on the granite, fingers of algae, sea anemones like the trunks of a miniature forest with pink and brown tentacle branches. And maybe Stan was able to capture on camera what was happening between Rachel and Dorothy that day as they peer into the pools together, crouching close, side by side, looking down into these whole tiny worlds.
Is that the end? Okay. So as you can hear, there's not a lot of academic talk in that introduction. It's a scene that I wrote based on something that I knew happened, and I was really trying to imagine this like rich interaction and bring it to life with my own writing and make it feel like a story. And that was like a challenge that I had to set for myself throughout the piece. I felt like I had to be really, really, really picky about the moments that I included any analysis or academic language at all. I felt like I was playing this game where I had to make the listeners invested enough in the characters and the story itself and the plot so that they would be ready and like willing to hear some analysis at the end. So that was one strategy that I used, which had a lot to do with just like chronological order. Like I put the love story in chronological order. And another thing that I had to deal with making this story was that none of the characters in the story were alive, which I think is like very common if you're trying to translate academic work. You're often working with an archive that's made of paper. So in this piece, the only voices that I had of my characters were from the letters that they wrote, and they wrote thousands and thousands of letters. So this is like an example of how one of the letters was written. And as you can see, the letters were like quite dense and kind of sappy. But I also just really liked them. I thought they were really moving. So in these, they're writing to each other about like walking along, listening to birds, and sort of wishing for each other. And yeah, I'm just gonna play one more clip from this story. You'll hear this is Rachel and Dorothy again. I love all the pictures of them together. So you'll hear in this clip one of the letters and how I kind of tried to bring it to life, and also you'll hear Lita Maxwell, the scholar that I interviewed, and just try and listen to the tone in Lita's voice too.
How can I find the right words to give you this, my perfect birthday gift to you?
Here's Dorothy, writing in the spring of 1955.
In the field of the intangibles, darling, I can think of nothing else I could offer you that might bring you more delight. Do you know what I'm going to tell you tonight, my beloved? I heard Fearing singing on Southport, in West Southport, on the Dogfish Head Road. And can you believe this? At the juncture of the road where we turned to go sharply around the corner to the dream house. Can you imagine how I felt, darling? The end of our quest, within a quarter of a mile of the dream house. You must know the warm glow that spread over me, but you must also know the dull ache too, because you aren't here to share it.
What I like about the relationship, among other things, is that it shows us the limits, right? What they valued in it was that it shows us the limits of kind of our social categories, right? Of our ways of understanding love and relationships. And they wanted to just sit with that, right? To sit with the mystery and the puzzlement and feel its beauty.
So a note on how Lita was talking there. When I interviewed her, I really tried to get her to speak not just from like this place of being an academic expert, but also from an emotional place. So I talked to her a lot about like, okay, why did you care enough about this research to read all of this archive? And I think having that discussion really helped her talk in a way that, for me as a listener, was just like a bit more moving. And I think that's really a key part of telling this specific type of story. Like telling a clear story a lot of times means telling a story that people understand on an emotional level. Okay, this is my thing number 2, which also I'm like, can that work? So a couple years ago, this environmental reporter that I know, Ashley Ahern, asked me to sound design this series that she was working on about this bird, which looks really crazy. It's the sage grouse. And it's this bird that if you live in the West, you probably have heard about it. It's very controversial, it's endangered, everyone has different feelings about what should happen to it. And I had always sound designed my own stories, just because I like that part of the process. It feels like an important part of it to me. And I had worked on little sound design projects for various shows that I'd been at, but I'd never sound designed a whole series before. And so I was kind of like, what is my job here? And what I kind of decided was that my job as a sound designer on this series would be to kind of try and figure out if I could use the way the story sounded and the way there was music and sort of scene tape to kind of bring a listener into this environmental story that they had probably heard before and make them sit with it in a new way. I don't know, I think stories about environmental issues, especially, people come to them sort of feeling like, I already know what I think about this. But with this series, we had 8 episodes. We had a lot of space, and I was like, okay, there's some potential there to kind of tell something that's more nuanced, more expansive. And I was like, maybe sound can help. So there were 2 ways that we really used sound, I think, to try and tell a different kind of story with this show. This is Ashley. If you look, this big puffy thing that she's holding is her microphone, which I'm like, think is so amazing. She's a real cowgirl, which is cool. And she spent so much time out in the field, so there was a ton of tape of her like wandering around through ranches, talking to people. So one of the things that we did with sound was really try to make her sound different than a host normally does. So I'm just going to play a little clip of, this is like the open of one episode. So this would be the very first thing that someone would hear when they started listening to the show.
So I'm in Sublette County in Wyoming. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning. And I'm
This might be a little loud.
Nellie, the 96 Chevy diesel pickup truck, starts. So I can go and record sage grouse that are mating here right now. I'm just outside of Pinedale, Wyoming, which is in the southwestern part of the state. And to get here, I drove through miles and miles of open sagebrush country. Just harsh, windswept landscape all around me. Not a whole lot going on besides ranching and extracting stuff from the earth. Coal, oil, and around the Pinedale area, a whole heck of a lot of natural gas. This area is known as the Jonah Field, one of the largest natural gas plays in the country. And, bad coincidence, it's also one of the last strongholds of sage grouse. So, that's why I'm here. And I'm hoping to God this works. Yes, Nellie, I fucking love you. Oh God, I'm so happy. She really doesn't start well in cold weather.
Okay, so that's Ashley. And yeah, so that's how we made her sound. A lot of the time her narration wasn't scripted at all. She was just like recording voice memos, wandering through the world, just like talking about what was going on with her. And I would mix that with sounds of her reporting, and then sometimes we would do these like real bits of narration that she had written before. And yeah, for me as a listener, I think hearing the host be a person rather than an expert who I'm just supposed to, I don't really like listening to people talk and then just being like, yes, okay, that's what you said. I much prefer to be with someone on a journey. And so presenting her that way, I think, really changed the way the show sounded. And then the second thing that we did, and that I thought about a lot when I was sound designing this series, was slowing down and thinking about how to help people slow down when they were listening. And this came in particularly handy when we were talking to people like conservationists or ranchers who often in especially radio stories have like a particular sort of point that they're trying to make that you kind of expect them to say, and you think you know how they're going to say it. So I'm just going to play a little clip about this time that Ashley went out with one conservationist to see the birds do this mating dance. And she and the conservationist were both zipped into separate little tents, and he had a lav mic on, so they couldn't see each other. And they're watching the birds. So you'll hear him sort of whispering to himself, and you'll also hear the birds, and they make this really crazy bubbling sound. So just maybe listen to pace in this clip.
They open a display. They have their pick of the most attractive mates, so they don't have to show off. These two are threatening each other again. They do come to blows over these little 10 by 10 foot patches of territory on the dance floor. The sun still isn't up yet, but it's starting to get light. You can hear the coyotes calling to each other. They don't bother the sage grouse.
Before Eric and I zipped ourselves into our respective blinds, I gave him a list of questions. The last one was, what do you wish your opponents understood about you?
The one thing that I wish the opponents of conservation, the industries that are destroying sage grouse habitat, threatening the natural values of the West, would understand about me is that the battle doesn't go to the swift or the strong. The battle doesn't go to the one with the most money. The battle goes to the last one standing on the battlefield. And I plan to outlast them all. For those industries bent on destroying Western public lands for their own profits, I'm watching.
When Eric said that, sitting in the blind next.
Okay. So this person is like really bombastic when he talks in normal life. But I just felt really lucky that we were able to sit with him in this scene and just be like, what is going on in your own head? And hearing him talk in that way and being able to really stretch it out and play with music and hear all the things that he was hearing, it just made his words resonate with me. And I was like, okay, yeah, you're right, okay. Okay, thing number 3, I'm calling beyond convincing the audience. So a lot of the time at the jobs that I worked in the last few years, I was working in these mainstream newsrooms. So I would be like at NPR, working at Planet Money, sort of in my head being like, okay, how do I make this story like less capitalist? And I had this kind of like antagonistic relationship in my head with the audience, where I was sort of thinking like, okay, every story that I put my hands on, I need to like make sure that it sort of like convinces people a little bit, or it like opens someone's mind. But a couple years ago, my friend Dan asked me to make this new show for him. He runs a podcast called The Dig, which is like a interview podcast where he talks to left-wing academics mostly for like a long time. It's like very different than the work that I do. It's these long interviews. But he asked me to make a show that would be narrative audio documentaries with the politics of his show and for his audience, which is this like super engaged, very politicized audience. And so for me, I was kind of like, what do I do? Like, what do I do with this audience? Because I was so used to making these stories where the goal was to sort of subtly change people's minds, and this was really different. It was like, okay, the starting point is we're all on the same page. Where do we go from there? And how can an audio story be useful in this context? It's like, what do you do if you don't have to convince people? And also, like, can you fit these really big and complicated political ideas into stories and scenes? It kind of went both ways for me. So I'm just going to give a few really very quick examples of the stories that we ended up making. We published 13 stories. This was during COVID, height of COVID in 2020. So they're all kind of about that. And all the stories were really different. So one example is this story that I really loved by 2 radio producers, Cass and Arlie. Cass lives in the US, Arlie lives in the UK, and during the pandemic, they started having a lot of Zoom conversations, giving each other medical advice. And so they wanted to make a story that was sort of about the way that they, in this moment, had started giving each other medical advice, but also how that's like a thing that trans people do all the time. And the main thing that I loved about this story was that Cass and Arlie were just like, we are making this story for us. Like, this is the story that we personally would want to listen to. And I just thought that was cool that we could have this space where they didn't have to be like, here, let me explain like the basic parts of my life to an audience that might be like really transphobic. So I'm gonna, the story that they ended up making was just like super intimate and beautiful, and it had a lot of clips from their conversations over Zoom, and also at the end, Arlie was injecting tea for the first time and recorded that whole process. So I'm just gonna play a tiny clip of that ending.
And then you just pull it out straight out.
Okay. Another piece that we made, Ari Mejia, who's an amazing producer based in Chicago, made a piece in collaboration with her friend who is incarcerated and serving a life sentence, and they just had like a bunch of phone calls early on in the pandemic, and we were able to turn those into a story that he had a lot of input in, like how the story sounded. So yeah, again, it was really interesting to make a piece where the starting point was like, okay, we all agree that incarceration is bad, and then we get to go, where do we go from there, rather than some centrist starting point. So this is just a little bit of like how Patrice sounds.
At 2:30 today, I am going to get up and willingly walk 70 paces to a door, have someone unlock it, I go in if they close it, and not resist that at any point.
So that's him. He's a really powerful speaker. We made a story about the visionary sci-fi writer and critic Samuel Delany. But the story was mostly about his experience at communist summer camp when he was a child, and how that, especially the music that he listened to and sang there, and how that experience as a kid helped him develop the ideas about class that he had, that he sort of worked into his writing as an adult. So I'm just gonna play a tiny clip of that. The music is really fun. These are all recordings from the camp itself. Oop.
This was how the Woodland campers learned the ABCs of solidarity. They weren't being sent down into the hills to gawk at weird yokels. They were going around their neighborhood, learning how to make connections with people who they were already invisibly connected to, just as surely as the Downsville Reservoir was linked to the plumbing system of New York City.
There are germs of every kind in any food that you...
One of the things that Woodland did seed in me was a sense of the importance of neighborhood. And I still think neighborhoods are very important, because neighborhoods are where things start.
For some little bug is sure to get you someday.
If you have social problems, it is in a neighborhood that you learn what these social problems you have.
For some little germ is sure to find you some.
Okay, so that was Sam Delaney. And then last example, we did this story with the writer Andrea Long Chu, who made a piece about her pandemic Dungeons and Dragons game, and sort of the political impact of having the type of relationship that you get to create in a game like that. And the thing that I loved about this story was that it was just really, really, really smart and challenging, which I don't always hear, like really rigorous stuff in radio stories, but it also was super fun and full of heart, which is the thing that I love about radio stories. So you'll just hear a tiny bit of how she sounds.
That's the secret of D&D. The game might be high fantasy, but the relationships between the people who play, those are real. And I don't mean real in a fictional sense, like how Frodo Baggins is real from the perspective of Frodo Baggins. I mean, absolutely, unimpeachably, if you prick us, do we not bleed, real. The players in my game haven't just fought goblins and saved villages. They've also scored drugs, listened to music, gone shopping, adopted pets, all within the game. They've dined and dashed, they've gotten thrown in prison, they've crashed parties, gotten drunk, kept secrets from each other, they've had terrible arguments. And sometimes they've done nothing at all. At the end of the day, they've been spending time. I mean that in a technical sense, not clock time, but time as the minimal unit of the social relation. Time is the smallest thing it's possible to share with someone else. That kind of time doesn't just happen. It's got to be summoned, the way fantasy characters might summon a god.
Okay, that was her first radio story ever, which I was like, oh, so good. Okay, this is my last thing that I want to talk about, form. So there is one type of story that I've gotten really good at making over the past few years, and I think the shorthand is like the hero's journey. So it involves one central character who faces a problem and then learns something in the process of facing that problem. And there's a narrator who has a lot of authority, and time moves in a linear way, and people make progress. And when I'm reporting that kind of story, I go into the interview kind of knowing exactly what I want out of it. So I'll have it totally planned. I know exactly what question I'm trying to answer. And I think that type of story is really, really useful because it's super efficient and you can make it fast. And also, like, it works. People who listen kind of are engaged. Like, it's really easy to listen to, and then there's a takeaway at the end. So I'm not against this type of story, but it's also really not how the world works. And lately I guess I've just been thinking about the work that has moved me the most that I've encountered, and it's normally stories where I have to do a little more work as the consumer of the story. So stories that challenge me or sort of force me to think about the contradictions of the world in my own head or draw my own conclusions in some way and not just be told, like, this is what you should learn from this. So lately in my own work, I've been trying to push myself more to make stories like that, which is really hard because there aren't a ton of examples of radio stories that kind of do that. So I've been taking inspiration from forms outside of radio. The first one that I'm going to talk about is oral history. This is a really amazing book about the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's built from maybe like thousands, but definitely hundreds of really, really, really long interviews that Svetlana Alexievich did with all kinds of regular people who lived through this time period. And she does these really, really long interviews and then boils them down, edits them down so they're all in a regular person's words, but they kind of read like literature. And so when you read it, you're left with this cast of characters who are telling this history, and they're like, a lot of them are really unlikable. A lot of them contradict themselves or each other. But for me, when I was done reading this book, I was like, okay, I understand something like really, really, really true about this time that is like nuanced and emotional and deep. So I've been thinking about how to do that in audio stories, basically just like, can we make audio stories with many narrators? Another form I've been thinking about is fragments. So these are two novels that I read in the past few years, and they're both built from fragments. So like tiny little vignettes or moments of dialogue, and that are just kind of like set up next to each other. So this is a page from Lost Children Archive, and you can see it's like two really, really short scenes. This is a page from Weather, which is even shorter. It's just these like tiny, tiny fragments. And yeah, I guess I just noticed that as a reader, I really like seeing all these bits of things kind of stacked together and then having to do the work myself of being like, okay, what does this mean though? So in my own work, I've been trying to develop basically like a note-taking practice for trying to prepare myself for making audio stories like that. So I take notes on my phone all the time, like tiny little notes whenever there's like a small thing that I want to remember. I take notes like that. And I also record like random things that happen in my life, moments that, wouldn't count as like important if I was trying to make like some dramatic story, but things that I'm like, maybe I just want to store this. Like maybe eventually this will build up to meaning something. So it's like tiny, tiny stuff. Like this is like a random woman I met on a dock talking to me in New Orleans.
That's where we saw it because they had a local article in the Thibodeau paper. And Fred said, where do you want to go for Mother's Day or something? And I said, I want to go there. And we came here.
She was just telling me about a restaurant that she really liked, and I just loved how much she loved it. This is like, I think this is my dad telling me about how I should take care of my car.
Okay.
And we're just like standing out in my driveway. So yeah, who knows whether any of this will add up to something, but it's what I'm trying. And then the last thing is the idea of conflict as a central plot point. I'm trying to figure out like how do we get away from conflict as a central plot point. So I read this article last year about the French film director Céline Sciamma and the ways that she in her films is trying to stop using conflict as the driving element of plot. So she sort of talks about how it's boring and masculine, and that if two characters, instead of deciding to have a fight, decided to work on something together, there might be totally new ways of thinking about a story, and you might be able to build like a story that you otherwise wouldn't have imagined. So everyone should read this article. It's amazing and full of so much just like practical information. But this is the last thing I'm going to say, is that she gives this practical tip in the article about how she builds stories that aren't focused on conflict as plot, which I thought was so cool. So she makes two lists. One list is all the scenes that made her want to make the film in the first place, like the scenes that she just loves, that she's like, this is the point of the movie. And then the other list is all the scenes that she thinks she needs to drive the plot forward. And then she connects one list to the other. She matches something from the first list to the second list. And anything left over on the second list, any leftover so-called necessary scene, she just gets rid of. And she says that helps her kind of figure out new sort of rhythms for how a story can work. So I'm like, can I do that? That would be cool. So that's what I got. It's basically a lot of different attempts to make stories that are useful, and I think I've just been trying different things and figuring it out, and a lot of them are really contradictory. You can't do all of them at once. But yeah, I think it's worth trying, and it's also fun to try. So yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts. Yes. Tell me your questions.
Recording the event. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you. Don't be shy. I don't mind waiting.
I'm really like, what am I talking about? Ask me all your questions. It'll help me think. So.
I was curious, in your video recordings of day-to-day life, do you tell people you're going to record them, or does that interrupt like the naturalness of the recording?
Oh, that's a dark question. I usually do. Or I'll have my phone out in a really obvious way, where I'm like, okay, you can just use your eyes and see. Yeah. And if I was ever to use a recording, I would certainly be like, hello, how do you feel about this? Is this okay? So, yeah.
Yeah, I found your point about like deconstructing like academic ideas into like a story to be really interesting. Like I'm thinking about, like I'm a longtime listener of Radiolab. I'm thinking about like the early days of Radiolab where it's like mostly neuroscience.
Yeah.
Like, I'm wondering how like you go about constructing that narrative. Like
Yeah, that's a big question. I think I think for me, it usually starts with talking to the academic about like, why do you care, And I think that's what they do at that show too. They get to know the scholar as a person and sort of figure out like, okay, where are the moments where they actually have like feelings about this idea? Because that's definitely the most interesting part. And it's also the thing that will sound best. And then I think like working backwards from there, I feel like in the Rachel Carson piece, I really had to like superimpose a really linear plot onto it because the ideas were so abstract. And I really had to be like, what is something in this story that has a beginning, middle, and end? Just so that I could stick the idea part, which was what I really cared about, in there somewhere. And I think you can usually do that with any idea, even if it's just like, how did you start thinking about this? Where were you in your life or like, did you have a moment where this idea impacted you personally? And people usually have an answer to that question, and that's like the start of a narrative, and then you can kind of go from there. Or maybe the idea like changed over time. Like maybe the idea started one way, and then it, developed over 100 years. Yeah. There's a lot of different ways, I think.
If you just go around recording much of your life, how do you know when you've got something that you want to move forward with? Like, how do you know, okay, this is a story that I'm going to develop?
I don't know. I don't. No, I really don't know. This is totally new for me. I haven't made that many personal stories before, but I guess I just noticed that the stuff that I liked reading was like about the world and the problems of the world, but framed through a pretty personal and like intimate and small lens. And so I was like, how do I do that? So yeah, I spent a lot of time in October writing a story that I was like, is this a story? I don't know. And I found that when I just started free writing, I discovered that there was like a narrative in what I was writing about. And then I was like, did I make any recordings during that time? And then kind of fit them back in that way. But who's to say? I don't know. I don't know if it'll work. This is new.
Hi, I was just wondering if there were any audio or radio-based narrative opportunities that you pursued here at Brown, or like, I guess since this is kind of new, you said, were there any general writing opportunities that you did here?
Yeah, so when I started at Brown, I actually got into making audio stories through this program that used to exist at the Swearer Center. I don't know if it still does, called Storytellers for Good, and it was this like, you kind of like make stories about whatever community service people are doing through that center. And so that was really the thing that made me start thinking like, oh, this medium I really love. When I was a sophomore, I started an audio publication on campus, and that was really how I learned to make stories. It was called Now Hear This, and there was maybe like, 20 people who would sit around and we would all like pitch each other ideas and edit our stories and really teach ourselves how to work in this form, and then we would publish them. So that's definitely the way that I actually learned. But what that really was like my friends giving me feedback on my work. And then the other thing that I did while I was in school was that I would just ask my teachers if I could make radio stories instead of writing papers. And I did that over and over. I think I did not write a paper in my last 2 years of school. I was in the American Studies department, so people were really invested in public scholarship. And so I had a lot of support doing that, but that was really huge for me. I just got to practice many times a semester. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. And I'm just wondering, I don't really know much about the actual publication of podcasts, but I really appreciated how you were saying about the trans helpline one, that they were kind of making it for themselves. I think that's really powerful, but I'm just wondering, when you publish something, and maybe if you're not working with a big distributor, how do you kind of deal with or kind of approach the idea of who's going to listen to this? What if nobody listens to this? What if everyone listens to this? Because I feel there's I'm in Professor Smolian's radio seminar, and we're talking about how there's just so much out there.
Yeah.
So how do you kind of confront that?
One thing that I've been thinking about, this is a side answer to this question, but one thing that I've been thinking about lately is how there's a lot of story podcasts in the world right now that are trying to be for everyone, and they're trying to be for a general audience, that they're trying to be super, super consumable, and often that means a true crime story, or just a really easy to understand protagonist doing something that everyone can get on board with. And I noticed that I just don't listen to those stories because that imagined audience isn't me, and I don't really know who it is. I think, and recently I have been talking to a lot of friends who used to make a podcast called The Heart, which was this really special show that was about queer love and sexuality. And they said that their whole philosophy in that show, that was the first show that I ever loved, that I was wow, I could make radio that sounds like this, that's so amazing. And they said that their whole philosophy was imagining that their listener was exactly like them, making the work that they personally would want to listen to. And I guess that's just something that I aspire to in my work, is sort of, I think that making work for a specific audience often leads to making work that people actually want to listen to. Yeah.
Maybe one more question. Did I see a hand go up? You go.
You talked a lot about wanting to find the realness of histories in the stories that you're looking for, but you're also asking people why they care about things, and you're crafting a little bit of an imagined world around their stories. And I'm curious how you think about the boundary between the work that you're doing as nonfiction and fiction, and what the role of what your role is, but also kind of where you live in this boundary, and how much you push on it in varying ways.
Yeah. I love a story. I love a meta story, a story that acknowledges the storyteller and all of everything that they're bringing into it. So I think that can be a really fun tool to play with, explicitly acknowledging I could never know what actually happened in this moment in history, and saying that as the narrator in the story. Or being maybe I imagine this. So I think that's something that I've sort of tried. But in general, I feel my job is to sort of think about how do we, how do I sort of help people feel feelings about a moment or an idea, and also tell the truth at the same time. And so I'm kind of like, whatever I need to do to get there. And I think for me, it feels really exciting to acknowledge like the impossibility of telling like a completely true history along the way. Yeah. Thank you all so much.